The first strand of hair fell onto the wet concrete before Delaney Shaw understood that more than 40,000 people were watching the live stream. The clippers whined against her temple, steady and cold, as if performing an ordinary chore. She sat against a concrete pillar on the rooftop of an abandoned parking structure in South Boston, her wrists bound behind her with an orange cargo strap. Half her dark brown hair still hung over the shoulder of her custodial uniform. The other half was shaved down to the skin. Melting snow and engine oil pooled beneath her in dark streaks, and in those streaks lay her hair. 3 men stood around her, laughing. "Look at her," Boone Mercer said, delighted. "You wash the windows of this whole city and not one soul remembers your face. 40,000 people remember it now." Delaney lowered her eyes. She said nothing. Boone pressed the clippers to her head again. The machine screamed. Another section slid from her shoulder and settled into the oil and snow. Behind the camera, Grady Pike turned the screen around to show it off. 41,000. Still climbing. Comments poured down like hail. "Take the other side. That's what debtors get. This is gold." Delaney heard every word. She had been hearing words like that for 2 years. The only difference was that they used to arrive in the mail. But when Boone leaned in close for a better angle, something strange happened. She smiled. Not a happy smile, just the faintest movement at the corner of her mouth, so slight that no one standing farther away would have caught it. Boone caught it. He stopped. "What are you smiling at?" Delaney slowly raised her head. "You should shut it off." All 3 of them laughed. "Or what?" She looked past his shoulder, toward the ramp leading up to the roof, where the darkness had swallowed the last working light. Before he sees this, Boone switched off the clippers. The rooftop went so quiet they could hear water dripping from the concrete overhang. Then Grady's phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. A private message appeared over the live stream window. "Turn off the camera." Then a second one. "Take your hands off her. Now." Grady opened the account. No name. Not a single post. Only a silver eagle head emblem on a black background. He shrugged. Some idiot with too much time. Boone held the clippers up to the lens like a trophy. "Then let's give him something worth watching." The machine started again, and not one of them noticed the 3 black cars rolling up onto the roof. No horns, no flashing lights, only the sound of tires grinding over wet concrete. The headlights came on full. A door opened. A man stepped out, in a black wool coat that fell past his knees, and closed the door softly, as though loud noises were a kind of rudeness. He stood still between the beams of light and looked. He looked at the strap around her waist. He looked at the hair she had lost. Finally, he looked at the clippers in Boone Mercer's hand. His face did not change. He did not shout. He simply turned his head toward the men behind him and said 4 words. "Cut that strap off." Then he looked straight at Boone, and for the first time in his life, Boone Mercer understood why the woman he had tied to that pillar had never once been afraid of him. Because the man walking toward them through the headlights had not come to rescue anyone. He had come looking for a name, and 3 fools had just broadcast that name live to 40,000 people. If this story moved you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone who comes to mind, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Delaney. 11 days earlier, Delaney Shaw was cleaning windows on the 34th floor of a high-rise along the Seaport waterfront, working the night shift after most of the city below her had already gone dark. Boston in winter, seen from that height, looked like a map someone had forgotten beneath the open sky. Rooftops wore a thin layer of snow. The harbor water was black and still. Far in the distance, several cranes stood motionless against the skyline like metal skeletons waiting for daylight. Inside the building, the only sounds were the steady breathing of the heating system behind the walls and the soft drag of her cloth across the glass. Delaney worked slowly and methodically, from left to right, from top to bottom. She had cleaned this floor so many times that she knew exactly where the scratches were and where the reflected light struck back hard enough to sting her eyes. No one on the 34th floor knew her face. They left while there was still daylight, and when they returned the next morning, everything was clean, as though it had cleaned itself. On the corner of the conference room table, she found a brown leather wallet lying at an angle, half hidden beneath a stack of documents. Delaney set down her cloth. She opened the wallet. Inside were a driver's license, several cards, and a wad of cash so thick it had to be folded in half to fit. She looked at the money longer than she wanted to admit. Then she closed the wallet, placed it neatly in the center of the table, and wrote a note that she stuck on top. Found here. Nothing missing. That was all she wrote before moving on. When her break came, she sat in the locker room and opened her lunch container. Inside was half a sandwich she'd bought that afternoon. She took 4 bites, enough to quiet her stomach, then wrapped the rest in foil and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She did it neatly, with the practiced ease of a habit worn smooth by repetition. When her shift ended and she stepped outside the building, the wind off the water struck her, sharp and salty. She pulled up her collar, walked to the night bus stop, sat beside the window, rested her head against the cold glass, and watched the city slide past. By the time she reached her apartment in Dorchester, she saw it the moment she opened the door, lying on the floor in the strip of light spilling in from the hallway. A white envelope. In the upper left corner were the printed words, Meridian Lending. Delaney stood still for several seconds before bending to pick it up. She didn't open it right away. She hung up her coat, put the remaining half sandwich in the refrigerator, washed her hands, then sat at the kitchen table and tore open the envelope. It was the same form, the same column of numbers. $214,000. Beneath it was a smaller line of text, polite and cold, reminding her that this month's payment needed to be made on time to avoid additional charges. She had been paying for 21 months, $900 every month. She ran the numbers through her head again like a piece of music she'd repeated so many times she was sick of hearing it, and the number on the final line had barely moved at all. Delaney folded the paper into quarters, placed it in a drawer with the 21 nearly identical notices that had come before it, then turned off the kitchen light. The following afternoon, she was at the Ashmont Community Center, in the room at the end of the hall, where the radiator clattered and the windows had fogged over. 7 students sat in a half circle, holding instruments borrowed from the center, with old strings and cases whose paint was peeling away. Delaney didn't hold an instrument. She had never held one in front of the children. She stood, raised one hand to mark the rhythm, and sang the melody for them. She sang one phrase at a time and let them repeat it on their strings. "Listen closely here," she said. "This part doesn't need to be louder. It only needs to last a little longer." Her left hand hung at her side, the fingers loosely curled. Her little finger no longer straightened all the way. She didn't hide that hand, but she never used it to point. When the lesson ended, Goldie was already waiting in the hallway, sitting in a wheelchair whose front wheel leaned slightly out of alignment, holding a cup of hot water from the vending machine. "You teach strings without touching the strings," the girl said. "Don't you think that's funny?" Delaney pulled up the zipper on her coat. "The kids still hit the right notes." "Is that because they're good?" Goldie asked. "Or because you're good at teaching?" "Because they're not old enough yet to know they're bad," Delaney answered, and Goldie burst out laughing, the sound carrying through the cold hallway. The 2 sisters went home after night had fully settled over the city. Delaney took the half sandwich from the refrigerator, cut it in 2 on a warped wooden cutting board, warmed it in a skillet, then placed the larger half on her sister's plate. Goldie looked at Delaney's plate. "Why are you eating so little?" "I ate at work," Delaney said. "They always have leftovers from the conference rooms at night." Goldie looked at her for another second, then lowered her eyes to her food and didn't ask again. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall once more, thin and slow, settling over the roofs of the cars parked along the street. In the kitchen, the only sound left was the soft touch of a fork against a plate. Delaney sat there drinking warm water, watching her younger sister eat, with no idea that at that very moment, a few miles away, a man was opening a thick file and beginning to read names he had never signed. That man's name was Elias Ferraro, and that evening he stopped reading the file. He sat at the head of a table in a room on the 2nd floor of an old warehouse by the harbor, where the walls still bore the marks of shelving that had been removed years before. The room had 3 doors. He counted them when he entered, the way he counted the doors in every room he ever stepped into, an old habit so deeply rooted that even he no longer remembered when it had begun. In front of him stood an empty wooden table, a glass pitcher of water, and 2 glasses. Rowan Kessler was brought in close to midnight. He coordinated vessel schedules at berth number 7, had worked there for 7 years, and for the past 3 months had been selling container schedules to a third party he believed no one could trace. He entered the room with the expression of a man who had already prepared himself to be shouted at. His hands were stiff in front of his stomach. His eyes flicked toward the door that had just closed behind him. Elias didn't stand. He didn't greet him. He simply reached for the pitcher, filled 1 glass with water, then pushed it across the table toward Rowan. "Sit down," he said. His voice was low and even, no faster or slower than a man reading the weather. Rowan sat. He didn't touch the water. Elias watched him for a moment, then began to speak, and he spoke as though he were reciting a list he had memorized long ago and had no need to read from paper. "Your bank is Harrow Savings on Tremont Street," he said. "Your mortgage is 2 payments behind. The man handling your account is named Dunphy, and he's called you twice this week." "You didn't answer." Rowan blinked. "Your daughter is in 4th grade at Bellamy School on Fairhill Street," Elias continued. "Her bus stops at the corner in the afternoon, and your wife is the one who goes out to meet her." Rowan opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Redgate Transport terminated your subcontract this morning," Elias said. "You don't know that yet, because the notice was sent to your company address instead of your home. You'll know on Monday." The room was silent. That silence carried more weight than any shouting could have. And Rowan began to understand that the man sitting across from him wasn't angry at all. That was what sent the cold down his spine. Elias reached up and adjusted the cuff of his shirt, revealing an old steel-faced watch, its crystal marked by several faint scratches, the leather strap worn around the buckle holes. He didn't look at it. He only adjusted his cuff and lowered his hand again. "I can make you disappear from this harbor," he said. "I can make sure not one door in Boston opens for you again, and it'll take you 8 months to understand why, but I'm not going to do that." Rowan swallowed hard. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely there. "Because you have a child waiting for a bus on the corner of Fairhill Street," Elias said, "and that child hasn't done anything." He pushed the glass a little closer. "Drink." Rowan lifted it with both hands, and they trembled so badly that the water shivered against the rim. He managed to drink half. Elias watched him drink, then stood and fastened the button of his wool coat. "You're still whole," he said. "That's the part I'm leaving you. Don't go spending it somewhere else." He walked toward the door, paused for the briefest moment, and didn't turn around. Then he added one last sentence, lightly, as though reminding Rowan of some small and ordinary matter. "When you get Redgate's letter on Monday, don't call anyone. No one's going to answer." Then he left. 3 days later, Rowan Kessler submitted his resignation from berth number 7, sold his small truck, and moved his entire family out of Boston. No one went looking for him. No one touched him. No one said another word to him. One of Elias's men later said that Rowan left without saying goodbye to anyone, and the only things he left behind in his locker at the harbor were an old coat and the half glass of water he hadn't finished that night. The thick file Elias had opened the night before contained 4,000 names, and every one of them hung beneath legal entities bearing his family name. He hadn't created a single one of those entities. He had his people pull the list of registered addresses, and one line made him stop longer than the others, because it wasn't an office, wasn't a warehouse, wasn't a rented mailbox downtown. It was the address of a community center in Ashmont. The following afternoon, he went there alone. He left his car 2 blocks away and walked, his hands in the pockets of his coat, while melting snow ran into dirty water along the edges of the sidewalk. The building was low, its red brick darkened with age, the front steps cracked, the glass doors covered with flyers advertising free classes. He stepped inside and counted the doors. 4 doors, one at the front, one at the end of the hallway, and 2 emergency exits on either side. He walked down the corridor, reading the room signs, looking for something that resembled an administrative office, and found nothing. There was nothing here that should have served as the registered address of a legal entity worth millions of dollars. Then he heard singing. It came from the room at the end of the hallway, a woman's voice, not loud, singing a slow melody and then stopping, then singing the same phrase again, even more slowly. After every pause came the sound of children's strings repeating it. Out of rhythm, off key, then a little less wrong. Elias stopped at the door. The small pane of glass was fogged with condensation, so he could only see half the room. 7 children sat in a half circle, holding old instruments, and a woman stood in front of them, marking time with one hand. She wasn't holding an instrument. He watched her for a moment, and noticed something he hadn't intended to notice. She marked the beat only with her right hand. Her left hand hung beside her body, the fingers loosely curled, the little finger bent slightly inward and unable to straighten. She used that hand to hold sheet music, to pull up a child's zipper, to do things that didn't require her fingers to open fully. But she never raised it in front of anyone. The lesson ended. The children spilled into the hallway, noisy and laughing, bumping into his legs before apologizing and running on. The woman came out last, carrying several stacks of sheet music, and stopped when she saw that he was still standing there. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. "I'm looking at the property," Elias said. "Then you probably came through the wrong door," she said. "The office is at the other end of the hall, and everyone there has already gone home for the day." "How long have you taught here?" he asked. "Long enough to know that Radiator is about to die," she replied, then gave him a small nod and walked away. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. She assumed he was someone from the city doing an inspection, one of those people who occasionally came through to measure things and then disappeared, and she was used to people like that never coming back. Elias remained in the empty hallway for a little while longer, listening to the radiator rattle behind the wall. Then he left. He didn't know the name of the woman who had just spoken to him. He only knew that this address appeared in his records, and no one here had any idea. For Delaney, 3 things happened that week that she couldn't connect to one another. The first came on Wednesday morning. Another Meridian envelope lay on the floor, but this time the recipient line included the address of the Dorchester apartment she had moved into less than 2 months earlier. She hadn't given that address to anyone. She hadn't changed it on her bank records, hadn't reported it to the cleaning company, hadn't told anyone except her landlord and her sister. She carried the envelope to the window, turned it over in her hands several times, then put it in the drawer with the other papers. The second thing came Thursday evening. The shift coordinator at the cleaning company messaged her to say that beginning the following week, her assignment would change. She wouldn't be working on the 34th floor anymore. She was being moved to the 41st floor, the offices of Ferraro Development, a place she had never set foot in. She messaged back and asked why. The coordinator replied that the building had requested it, and he didn't know anything more. The third thing happened Saturday afternoon, and it was the strangest of all. Her landlord stopped her while she was guiding Goldie's wheelchair up the front steps. She said Delaney didn't owe anything for rent that month. Delaney told her she must be mistaken. The landlord shook her head and said there was no mistake. Someone had already paid 3 months in advance for the apartment, in cash, right at the counter. Delaney asked who it was. The landlord shrugged and said the person hadn't left a name, hadn't left a phone number, had simply handed over the money, waited for a receipt, and left. Delaney stood at the bottom of the steps with one hand still holding her sister's chair steady, snow falling onto the back of her hand and melting at once. She said nothing. Goldie looked back and asked what was wrong. "Nothing," Delaney said, then pushed the chair inside and closed the door. The following Monday, when the lesson was only halfway through, the classroom door swung open without anyone knocking. Boone Mercer walked in wearing a wine-colored bomber jacket and spotless white shoes in a hallway tracked with dirty snow, and he stood there looking around the room like a man inspecting a house scheduled for demolition. All 7 children stopped playing. Delaney set down the sheet music. She told them that break was coming early today, and she said it in such a normal voice that none of them thought anything was wrong. They gathered their instruments and ran into the hallway laughing, and the door closed behind them. Only then did Delaney turn back. Boone pulled out a plastic chair, sat down, and placed a stack of papers bound in blue on the table. He turned it toward her with 2 fingers. "Good news," he said. "Sign here, and it's over. No more envelopes, no more columns of numbers, wiped clean." Delaney looked at the papers but didn't touch them. "In exchange for what?" she asked. Boone leaned back in the chair. "The shop in Dorchester," he said. "Your father's instrument repair shop. The transfer papers are on the last page. All you have to do is sign. You don't use it anyway. It's been closed for 3 years, dust up to your ankles, and every year you still have to grit your teeth and pay the property tax. We take it, and we're done." Delaney stayed silent longer than he wanted. Outside in the hallway came the sound of children running past, their laughter rising and then fading away. "Do you know what's inside that shop?" she asked. Boone laughed. "Broken instruments," he said. "Rotten wood, rusted clamps. Tell me what I missed." Delaney looked straight at him. "Do you know my father's name?" she asked. Boone's smile faltered. It didn't disappear completely, but it stopped halfway and couldn't go any farther. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I take the papers they give me," he said, and his voice had changed. "I've had this file all week." "You don't know," Delaney said. "You're trying to take a shop when you don't even know the name of the man who built it." Boone stood faster than necessary, snatched the papers back, and tucked them under his arm. "Don't think you're clever," he said. "You have 7 days." Then he walked out, his white shoes striking hard against the tile, and the door slammed behind him with enough force to make the glass pane tremble. Delaney remained standing in the empty room for a long time, both hands braced against the edge of the table, and her left hand trembled slightly, not because she was afraid, but because she had clenched it too tightly without realizing it, because she remembered what the first set of papers had looked like. 3 days after the accident, she was 24 years old, and she hadn't slept for 3 nights. Her father lay at the funeral home on Adams Street. Goldie lay in recovery on the 4th floor of the hospital, surrounded by tubes and machines that sounded at steady intervals, and the doctor had told Delaney that the lower half of her sister's body might never come back. Delaney had sat in the hospital corridor through all 3 of those nights, her back against the wall, one hand still wrapped in bandages, her mind so empty that she couldn't remember what she had eaten, what she had said, or what she had signed for the hospital. Then a man in a gray coat came looking for her. He was polite, soft-spoken, called her Miss Shaw, and apologized for disturbing her at a time like this. He placed a stack of papers in her lap. He told her that her father had been named on a business loan, that according to the records, the instrument repair shop had been used as collateral, and that if no one assumed responsibility for the debt, the shop would be seized in less than a month. Delaney turned through the pages one by one. Her father's signature appeared at the bottom of every page, slanting to the right, the last stroke trailing out the way he always signed the instrument intake slips. And on the page near the end, she saw her own signature. It was the signature she had used when she was 18, when she had signed some kind of registration form for the shop on her father's behalf. Round and youthful handwriting, a style she had abandoned years ago. She stared at it and couldn't understand why it was there. The man told her it was an old attachment, that it wasn't important, that all she needed to do was sign the final page to convert the debt into an installment plan, $900 a month, and the shop would remain untouched. He held out a pen. Behind the door, 10 steps from where she sat, her sister was breathing through a machine. Delaney took the pen. She signed. She didn't read it again. She didn't ask anyone. She signed because during those 3 nights, that dusty shop in Dorchester was the only thing left of her father that no one had taken away yet, and she thought that if she could keep it, then maybe she could still keep something. She believed she had just saved something. It took 21 months before she began to suspect that all she had really done was sign her name to a lie. That evening, Delaney came home later than usual, and she knew immediately that something was wrong, because Goldie was sitting at the kitchen table with the light on, both hands resting on the tabletop like someone about to call a meeting to order. In front of her was the appointment schedule from the physical therapy clinic, crossed out in blue ballpoint pen. "I called them this afternoon," Goldie said. "I canceled everything starting next week." Delaney set her bag down on a chair. "When did you call?" "While you were sleeping," Goldie replied. "I picked that time on purpose." Delaney pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You didn't even ask me first. If I'd asked, you would have said no," Goldie said. "So I skipped that part to save time." Delaney looked at the schedule, then at her sister. "Why?" Goldie shrugged, and she did it in that particular way of hers, as though she were talking about the weather. "Because I know how to count," she said. "One therapy session costs $200. I haven't asked how much you make cleaning windows for one night, but I know you work 6 nights a week and still bring half a sandwich home. I can be bad at any subject I want, but I can do division. Every time I sit on that therapy table, you lose a week standing somewhere in the 30s in the middle of the night. It's too expensive. I'm not buying it anymore." Delaney didn't answer right away. She sat still with her hands on the table, her left hand resting there with the fingers loosely curled as always. "The doctor says you're making progress," she said. "The doctor says you have reflexes in your right thigh, and if you keep going, then in another year." Goldie cut her off. "In another year, I might be able to stand for 40 seconds instead of 20, she said. "I heard everything. I've sat in that room twice a week for 3 years. I know the poster on the wall and the crack in the ceiling by heart. 40 seconds. I love you more than I love those 40 seconds. Delaney heard those words, and something inside her chest broke open. She had held herself together for 21 months. She had held herself together when the envelopes came, when Boone sat in her classroom, when the landlord told her that a stranger had paid her rent, but she couldn't hold herself together against that sentence. She stood, walked around the table, then knelt in front of the wheelchair, both hands gripping the sides of the seat as she looked up at her sister. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice broke on the very first word. "I don't go to work so you can walk again." Goldie blinked. I go to work so you can still dare to want something, Delaney said. That's all. I don't care if it's 40 seconds or 4 seconds. What I care about is that twice a week you still have somewhere to go, an appointment to keep, something waiting ahead of you. The day you stop wanting, you'll start getting used to sitting still, and I'd rather stand on the 41st floor for the rest of my life than watch you get used to that. Goldie said nothing. Her eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. She had never cried in front of her sister. That was one of her private rules, and she kept it more strictly than almost anything else. She reached out, placed a hand on Delaney's head, and awkwardly smoothed down her hair. You know you're kneeling on the kitchen floor, right? I know, Delaney said. The floor is freezing, Goldie said. I know. The two sisters stayed like that for a while beneath the sickly yellow kitchen light, while outside the snow kept falling over the roofs of the cars parked along the street. Then Goldie cleared her throat. All right, she said. I'll call them back. But I have one condition. Delaney looked up. What condition? You have to eat dinner with me, Goldie said. Really eat, sitting at the same table, with the same meal, and no more of that leftovers from the conference room nonsense. I don't know where you came up with that line, but it's terrible. It's been terrible since the first month. Delaney laughed, the sound tangled with tears, half one thing and half the other. Deal, she said. Goldie held out her hand. Shake on it. Delaney took her hand, and Goldie squeezed harder than she expected. But every deal required money, and Delaney knew exactly how much was left in her account. The following night, after her shift, she didn't go straight home. She stayed on the bus for 4 more stops, got off in Dorchester, and stood in front of the rusted roll-up door of the instrument repair shop. The key had stayed in her coat pocket for 3 years, on the same ring as her house keys, and she had held it thousands of times without ever putting it into the lock. This time, she did. Inside, it was darker and colder than the street outside. The smell of wood, old glue, varnish dried hard with age. On the workbench, a bow still waited to be rehaired, beside several wooden clamps and a jar of rosin that had hardened into a solid lump. Dust covered everything in a layer so thick that when she laid her hand on the workbench, it left a mark as clear as a print in snow. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. She switched on only the desk lamp with the tin shade that her father had used when inspecting the faces of instruments. And in that pool of yellow light, she saw it standing in the corner, exactly where it had stood for 3 years. The black cello case, its leather handle worn, its 4 metal latches dulled with age. Delaney had walked past it more times than she could count, had dusted around it, had once even placed her hand on the handle before pulling it away. She had never opened it, not because she had forgotten, because she couldn't bear to. She sat down on the floor in front of it, placed both hands on the lid, and stayed that way for a long time before opening the first latch. The click sounded louder than she expected in the empty shop, then the second, the third, the fourth. The lid opened, and the cello lay inside, untouched, its deep reddish wood shining beneath the desk lamp, all 4 strings still taut, the bridge still standing exactly where it belonged. Delaney reached out, then stopped halfway. She didn't touch it. She only looked. There was a shop in the South End that bought old instruments. She had called that afternoon to ask what it might be worth, and they had told her that if the wood was still good, it could pay for 4 months of therapy, maybe 5. She calculated that number again in her head, and she hated herself for how quickly she did it. She tilted the case to check whether there was any mildew beneath the interior lining, because the buyer would ask, and when she lifted it, one corner of the velvet lining pulled loose from the bottom. It had come away at the edge, where the glue had decayed with time. Delaney tugged gently. The entire section of lining slid free, easily, as though someone had once glued it back by hand rather than by machine. And beneath that lining, pressed flat against the wooden bottom of the case, were 3 things. The first was a stack of papers folded in half, the edges yellowed with age, held together by a paper clip that had rusted into a brown stain. The second was a small audio cassette, an old kind with a clear plastic shell and a blank white label. The third was a photograph. Delaney picked up the photograph first. 2 men stood in front of a warehouse in harsh sunlight, both wearing shirts with the sleeves rolled up. The man on the left was her father. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair still black, one hand resting on his hip, and he was smiling that slightly awkward smile of a man who wasn't used to having his picture taken. The man on the right was half a head taller, but she couldn't see his face. Someone had covered it completely in black marker, going over it again and again until the ink had pressed grooves into the photographic paper, making it rise like a scar. The rest of the man remained untouched, his shirt, his arm, his hand hanging beside his body, a round-faced watch on his wrist. Only the face was gone. Delaney turned the photograph over. On the back, written in blue ballpoint pen in handwriting that slanted to the right, ending in the long trailing stroke she recognized before she had even finished reading, was a single line. This debt never existed. Delaney read the sentence 3 times. Then she placed the photograph on the floor, opened the stack of papers, and held them beneath the desk lamp. She read the first page. She read the second. By the third page, her hands had begun to shake, and she had to rest the papers on her lap to keep them still. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the shop window before disappearing. Delaney sat in the middle of the dusty floor, her father's cello lying open in front of her, and she wasn't thinking about selling it anymore. She took the papers, the cassette, and the photograph home, tucked all 3 beneath the lining of the instrument case, carried the whole case with her, and that night she couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the steady breathing of the heater behind the wall, to water moving through the pipes in the neighboring apartment, even to the sound of her sister breathing in the room across the hall. Then the phone on her nightstand lit up. Delaney looked at it for a while before reaching for it. A message from an account with no name. "They know you opened the instrument case." She sat upright. She read the words again, looked toward the window, then back at the screen. There were no 3 dots, nothing to show that the other person was still typing. She tapped the reply box, typed 2 words, then erased them. She typed again, erased again. In the end, she wrote only 1 sentence. "Who are you?" There was no answer. She sat in the darkness, the instrument case standing in the corner beside her bed, and waited. Then the screen lit a second time. "You're not the only one. You're the only one still alive who still has the papers." Delaney read that sentence, and suddenly the room seemed larger, colder, with far too many doors. She got up, went into the living room, checked the deadbolt on the front door, pulled the curtains closed, then stood there with one hand still resting on the edge of the fabric, looking down at the snow-covered street below. A car was parked across the road, and she couldn't remember which house it belonged to. It was completely dark. It might have been there all week. She didn't know. That was the frightening part, she thought. Not the car itself, but the fact that she didn't know how long it had been there. The phone lit up a third time. "Don't let them take you to the roof." Delaney stood very still for a long time with those words in her hand. What roof? Where? She typed exactly that question and pressed send. The message didn't go through. It stayed there, the little circle turning and turning until it became an exclamation mark. She opened the profile of the account. No name, no photographs, not a single post, only a silver badge shaped like an eagle's head against a black background, old and simple, the kind of crest people carved into the gates of houses that had stood for generations. She stared at it until her eyes hurt. On the other side of the city, in the middle of the night, when the only sound left in the building was the heating system moving through the pipes, one light was still burning on the 41st floor. Elias Ferraro sat alone before the file spread open across the long table. 4,000 names, printed in columns, each one accompanied by a case number and a legal entity behind it. He had read through the first 300 pages, and he still hadn't found a single signature of his own. The man standing beside the table was named Augie Renner, silver-haired, wearing a gray sweater, and he had been in this house since before Elias knew how to tie his shoes. He stood waiting with his hands folded in front of him and said nothing. Elias turned another page. Then he stopped. He wasn't reading quickly anymore. He placed one finger on a line in the middle of the column and kept it there. The address listed beside it as collateral was an instrument repair shop in Dorchester. He picked up a pen and circled the name. Hollis Shaw. "Is this man still alive?" he asked. Augie Renner looked down at the page. He didn't step any closer. He only looked, and there was a very brief pause before he answered, so brief that Elias didn't notice it, and years later he would remember that he hadn't noticed. "No," Augie said, "but his daughter is." 3 days later, Delaney was still going to work as usual because she didn't know what else to do. She carried the instrument case with her every day, kept it in a locker in the changing room, locked it, and every few hours she went downstairs to check on it. That night, She finished her shift on the 41st floor, put away her cleaning cart, changed clothes, carried the instrument case out through the rear exit, and went down into the employee parking garage. The garage was underground, its ceiling lights a sickly yellow, cold rising from the concrete floor. She was halfway toward the exit ramp when she saw it. A white van was parked sideways across the way up, its engine still running, red taillights spilling across the wall. Delaney slowed. The van door opened. 3 people got out. She recognized the man in front immediately because those white shoes were far too clean for everything around them. 7 days, Boone Mercer said. Delaney took 1 step back. Her eyes went to the elevator door behind her, measuring the distance. Then she abandoned the thought. "I don't have anything with me," she said. "You do," Boone said. "You've been carrying it around all week. You keep it in your locker. Second one down from the top. Combination 37. Delaney said nothing. The man standing to Boone's left was young and thin, wearing black-framed glasses and a knit cap pulled down over his ears, a phone in one hand. The third was younger still, his face almost boyish, standing half a step behind with both hands in his pockets and refusing to look directly at anyone. "Let's go," Boone said. "Easy. There are cameras down here, and I don't like other people's cameras." Delaney looked at the instrument case in her hand. She thought of Goldie asleep at home, of the therapy appointment the next morning, of who would hear her if she screamed in an underground parking garage after the city had gone to sleep. Then she stepped forward. They drove through the harbor, past stacks of containers piled beneath the floodlights, then turned onto the ramp of an abandoned parking structure Delaney had never even noticed was there. The van climbed in circles, each level darker than the one below, until they reached the open top, where the wind off the water came straight at them with nothing to stop it. Delaney stepped out. She looked around once, and she understood what those 3 words in the message that night had meant. The man with the glasses, Grady Pike, was fumbling with his phone. He raised it, lowered it, then raised it again. His finger slipped across the screen twice. "Maybe we should just," he said quietly. Boone turned. "Just what?" "Nothing," Grady said. "It's just if this goes online." He didn't finish. His thumb moved toward the stop button, and the person who stopped him wasn't Boone. "Keep filming," Delaney said. All 3 of them turned toward her. Her voice wasn't loud. It was even almost calm, and that was exactly what made Grady's hand freeze. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said keep filming," Delaney replied. "Don't turn it off. If you turn it off now, no one's ever going to believe me later." Boone laughed. "Hear that?" he said to Grady. "She wants to be famous." Delaney didn't look at him. She looked straight into the phone camera in Grady's hand, and then she added one more sentence, slowly, every word clear. "Keep filming. One day you're going to wish you had turned it off." Grady raised the phone. His finger pressed the live stream button, and the viewer count began to climb from 2 digits. A few miles away, a black car was moving along the harbor highway, windshield wipers sweeping steadily across the glass. Elias Ferraro sat in the back seat, his wool coat still buttoned, a stack of papers open across his lap. His phone vibrated. He answered. He didn't say a single word during the entire call. He only listened, looking through the window as the streetlights slid backward into the darkness. Then he ended the call, set the phone beside him, and closed the papers on his lap. The driver glanced up at the rearview mirror. "Head for the harbor," Elias said. 2 men broke away from the line of cars and walked straight past Boone as though he didn't exist. One of them took out a small folding knife, slipped the blade beneath the orange strap around Delaney's back, and cut it. The strap snapped loose and fell onto the concrete, curling there like something that had just died. Delaney pitched forward. She threw out her hands to catch herself and realized both of them were so numb that she couldn't feel the cold ground beneath her palms. The second man stepped between her and the other 3, saying nothing, touching no one. Elias walked toward her. He unbuttoned his wool coat, pulled it from his shoulders, and draped it around hers. The coat still held the warmth of his body, and it was heavier than she expected. Then he knelt, one knee touching the ground, bringing his eyes level with hers. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Delaney shook her head. "They didn't hit me," she said. Her voice was rough from the wind. Elias looked at her for another moment. His gaze stopped very briefly at the side of her head, where her hair was gone. Then he looked away, and the way he looked away was the only thing that night that revealed how angry he was. "Who did it?" he asked. Delaney looked toward Boone. Elias stood. Boone Mercer had already backed away 3 steps. Then he did the thing he would later be unable to explain to anyone, including himself. He charged. It happened in less time than a single breath. Elias turned halfway, caught the wrist coming toward him, folded it inward in the direction the joint couldn't open, then brought it behind Boone's back. His other hand settled on Boone's shoulder and pressed down. Boone dropped to his knees, then ended up sitting hard on the wet concrete, one arm pinned behind his back, gasping for air. From the moment he charged to the moment he hit the ground, 4 seconds passed. Not one punch was thrown. Not one sound rose above the scrape of shoes across the concrete. Elias released him, straightened, and adjusted the cuff of his shirt until it sat neatly again. Grady was still holding up the phone. He had forgotten he was holding it. The screen stood upright in front of him, the viewer count jumping constantly, comments streaming past too quickly to read. Elias bent down. He picked up the electric clippers lying in the middle of a puddle, held them in one hand, and didn't look at Boone again. He walked over to Grady. "Turn it around," he said. Grady didn't understand. "The phone," Elias said. "Turn it toward me." Grady did. The camera swept across the concrete, across the puddle, then stopped on the face of the man in the white shirt. Standing without a coat between 2 beams of headlights, Elias looked directly into the lens. Then he switched on the clippers. Everyone on the rooftop heard the machine come alive. His men looked at one another. One of them stepped forward half a pace, then stopped. Elias raised the clippers to his own head and began to shave. He did it without hurry, without spectacle, without looking down or looking around, like a man carrying out something he had already decided. Locks of black hair fell onto the shoulders of his white shirt, then slid down to the concrete, mixing with the hair already scattered there. He finished one side, then moved to the other. No one said a word. Delaney sat against the pillar with his coat around her shoulders, watching him do it with a feeling she couldn't name. When he was finished, Elias switched off the clippers. He brushed his shoulder once with the back of his hand, then stopped. He was still looking straight into the camera. "Now she isn't the only person walking out of here looking like this," he said. Then he handed the clippers to the man beside him and turned his back on the camera as though it had never been there. On the screen in Grady's hand, the comments seemed to freeze for a moment. Then they began moving in a different direction. What did that man just do? Who is he? Why did he do that? The viewer count stopped slowing and suddenly surged upward. And now the words racing across the screen were no longer about the woman sitting beneath the concrete pillar. "Somebody call the police. That girl didn't do anything. I've been watching from the beginning, and I'm ashamed I laughed earlier." Grady lowered the phone to his chest, his hand shaking. "Turn it off," Boone said from the ground. Grady shook his head. "I can't turn it off," he said. "It won't stop." Another car reached the rooftop. This one a private sedan painted a deep blue, so clean that the headlights reflected off its surface. The door opened, and the man who stepped out had neatly combed silver hair, a stiff-collared white shirt, an overcoat hanging open, and thin leather shoes completely unsuited to the wet concrete beneath him. Sterling Ashcroft stopped the moment he got out of the car. He looked around once. He saw Delaney sitting beneath the pillar, with a man's coat draped over her shoulders. He saw Boone sitting on the ground. He saw the line of black cars parked across the rooftop. And finally, he saw the phone in Grady Pike's hand, held upright, the screen glowing, the small red dot in the upper corner still blinking. His face changed. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had just heard a crack inside a wall he had spent years painting over. "What is this?" Sterling said. Boone scrambled to his feet, wiped his hands on his pants, and for 1 second still tried to force a grin. "I got it, Dad," he said. "I know where she keeps the papers. I just needed to make her understand that." Sterling walked straight up to him. He didn't shout. His voice dropped low and sharp, like a blade drawn across paper. "I told you to get the papers," he said. "Did I tell you to put on a show?" Boone blinked. "What are you talking about?" "What is that?" Sterling said, pointing toward the phone. "You're live streaming. You're live streaming this. I wanted you to see," Boone said, and suddenly his voice became smaller, like a child's. "I wanted you to see that I could do it. You're always telling me I can't do anything right." Sterling stood perfectly still. In that moment, everything he had spent years building, the business awards, the speeches about credit for low-income families, the ribbon cuttings where he always stood in the center, all of it was passing before the eyes of 40,000 viewers, and the only reason was a boy who wanted to be called his son. "Do you know how many people are watching?" Sterling said. Boone didn't answer. Sterling turned toward Grady. "Turn it off." Grady shook his head, his face drained white. "I can't," he said. "I already pressed it. It's still running." Sterling snatched the phone from his hand. He pressed the screen twice, then 3 times, then stared at it and stopped trying. At that exact moment, Sterling looked up, and for the first time that night, he truly saw the man standing between the 2 beams of headlights. The man without a coat, his head freshly shaved, one hand calmly adjusting the cuff of his white shirt. He recognized him. Not his name. He recognized the way he stood, the way he said nothing at all, and the scratched steel-faced watch on his wrist. Sterling Ashcroft had seen that watch once before in his life, many years ago, on another man's wrist. The blood drained from his face, the phone lowered in his hand. He took half a step back without even realizing he had moved. Elias said nothing. He only looked at him for a long time, with the gaze of a man confirming something he had already suspected. Then he turned toward one of his men. "Call Mrs. Vaughn," he said. "Tell her we have a witness." And in the distance, at the bottom of the ramp, the first sirens began to rise from the harbor road. The following morning, a woman named Priscilla Vaughn called Delaney and arranged to meet her at a federal building across the harbor. She spoke briefly, without wasting a single word. And the only instruction she gave was to bring the originals. Don't send photographs. Don't send anything by email. Bring the actual papers directly into her hands. Delaney carried the instrument case out of the apartment before daylight had fully broken. One of Elias's men drove her. They crossed the harbor, turned into the underground tunnel, and there, between 2 long walls lined with white tile beneath yellow lights, everything happened very fast. A black car pulled up close on the left. It didn't pass. It stayed beside them. The driver glanced over. Then he pressed the accelerator. The other car accelerated with him. A second vehicle came up from behind and pressed tight against the right side. The 2 cars boxed them in. "Hold on," the driver said. Delaney hugged the instrument case against her chest. The car on the left pushed inward. Metal scraped against metal. The shriek thundered through the tunnel, bouncing from the walls, sounding like something being torn apart. Their car swerved. The one on the right slammed into the rear. The front end jerked sideways. The driver fought the steering wheel. The left window shattered. Broken glass sprayed inside, scattering white across the seat. Wind screamed through the opening. Delaney ducked low, both arms locked around the instrument case. The car on the left shoved them again. Their vehicle skidded to the right. The tires ground against the curb. The driver hit the brakes. The car spun sideways, slid a long distance across the wet concrete, then stopped at an angle in the middle of the tunnel, the engine still running. The other 2 cars stopped several yards away. Doors opened. 3 men got out. The driver turned around. "Take the case," he said. "Run back the way we came. Don't look behind you." Delaney shoved open the door. She jumped out while the car was still drifting slightly. Her feet hit the ground. Her knees buckled for a moment. Then she stood. She held the instrument case with both arms, pressed it against her chest, and ran. Footsteps came after her. She ran along the wall beneath the line of yellow lights. And in that moment, there was nothing in her mind. No fear, no thought, only the 4 hard corners of the case pressing into her ribs and the sound of her own breathing. A hand grabbed the handle. She yanked it back. The leather strap tore free from the other person's grip. She stumbled, slammed one shoulder into the wall, then kept running. Someone shouted behind her. Then the entire tunnel flooded with light. Headlights from the opposite direction swept straight into everyone's eyes. A black car was coming toward them, driving the wrong way down the middle of the tunnel without slowing. It didn't swerve. It came straight at the space between the other 2 cars. Then, at the very last distance, it swung sideways. Tires screamed. The body of the car slid in a long arc across the wet pavement and stopped crosswise, blocking the entire passage, its headlights still blazing at full strength. The door opened. Elias stepped out. He didn't run. He walked straight into the light, bareheaded, his wool coat whipping open behind him in the tunnel wind, and the 3 men stopped where they were. One of them recognized him. Delaney saw it clearly, saw the man's shoulders drop before he had even decided what to do. "Go back and tell him," Elias said. His voice carried through the tunnel, low and even. "Tell him I know who owns this car." The 3 men backed away. Then they turned and ran toward their vehicles. Doors slammed, tires shrieked. Both cars reversed, turned around, and disappeared toward the far end of the tunnel, leaving the roar of their engines echoing long after they were gone. The tunnel fell silent. Only the sound of water dripping somewhere from the ceiling remained, along with the idling engine of the car blocking the road. Elias turned around. He saw Delaney leaning against the wall, white dust smeared across one shoulder, both arms still locked around the instrument case, refusing to let go. He walked toward her. "Give it to me," he said. Delaney shook her head. "No," she said. Her grip tightened. "My father died because of this." Elias stopped. He looked at her, looked at both hands clamped around the handle, then lowered his own hand. "All right," he said. "Then you carry it." He stepped aside, opened the rear door of the car for her, and stood there in the brightly lit tunnel, waiting for her to get in on her own. They didn't go to Vaughn right away. Elias had the car turn toward a low building at the edge of the harbor, where there was a room on the second floor with 3 doors and a long wooden table. He counted the doors as he walked in, the way he always did. Delaney set the instrument case on the table, opened all 4 latches, and this time she didn't hesitate. She lifted the velvet lining from the bottom of the case. She took out the folded stack of papers and placed it on the table. She took out the small cassette and set it beside them. Then she took out the photograph. She pushed it across the table toward him. "This was under the lining," she said. "My father hid it there." Elias picked up the photograph. He studied it beneath the overhead light. 2 men stood in front of a warehouse, harsh sunlight falling over them, their shirt sleeves rolled up. The man on the left was thin, with black hair, one hand resting on his hip, smiling the awkward smile of someone who wasn't used to having his picture taken. The man on the right was half a head taller, and his face had been completely covered with black marker, gone over again and again, until the strokes had pressed into the photographic paper and made it rise beneath the ink. "That's my father," Delaney said, pointing to the man on the left. "I don't know who the other man is." Elias didn't answer. He was still holding the photograph. He brought it closer. He didn't look at the place where the face had been blacked out. He looked lower, at the taller man's arm hanging beside his body, at the rolled cuff of his shirt, at the round-faced watch on his wrist. In the photograph, it was no larger than a pea. The crystal caught the sunlight, but the leather strap had a distinct bend at the 3rd buckle hole, a crease worn pale from having been fastened at the same notch for too many years. Elias set the photograph on the table. He pulled back the cuff of his own shirt. The steel-faced watch was there, its crystal marked by several faint scratches, its leather strap worn, and at the 3rd buckle hole a deep white crease had been pressed into the leather. He laid his wrist beside the photograph. Delaney looked down. She didn't say anything. Her eyes moved from the watch in the photograph to the watch on his wrist, then back again, and she raised one hand to cover her mouth. Elias sat perfectly still. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't sigh. He simply sat there with one hand resting palm up on the table, staring at the photograph like a man waiting for it to speak for itself. "What was his name?" Delaney asked very softly. "Corbin Ferraro," he said. She waited. For a long time, he said nothing else. Then he reached for the papers, opened them, turned to the page listing the guarantors, and scanned the column of names. His finger stopped halfway down the page. He read it again. He folded the papers closed and placed one hand over them. "The record says it was a stroke," he said. "Who?" Delaney asked. "Him," Elias said. "Saturday morning, in his office. A doctor signed the certificate. The family didn't request an autopsy. The person who signed the funeral documents was my cousin. I was out of state at the time." He stopped. "I've been looking for years," he said. "I searched records, witnesses, any scrap of paper where his name appeared beside someone else's. There was nothing. Not one line." He looked down at the photograph. "And all this time it was under the lining of an instrument case in Dorchester," he said. "All those years." Delaney looked at the blacked-out face. "Why would my father do that?" she said. "Why would he erase his friend's face?" Elias picked up the photograph again. He turned it toward the light and studied the marker strokes carefully. The blacking began at the forehead and worked outward, covering the entire face but stopping cleanly at the line of the collar, without bleeding onto the shoulders or into the background. "Your father did this carefully," he said. "He didn't scribble over it. He covered exactly one thing and left everything else untouched." He set the photograph down. He wasn't angry with my father, Elias said. He was hiding my father. If someone else had found this photograph, all they would have seen was a faceless man standing beside an instrument repairman. He left the photograph for someone who would know how to look. Delaney sat down in the chair across from him. The two of them remained silent at opposite ends of the table, the photograph lying between them, with the cassette neither of them had touched resting right beside it. News of the live stream traveled faster than news of what had happened in the tunnel, and by the following afternoon the entire family knew. They summoned him back to the old house on Beacon Hill, to the ground floor dining room with its long wooden table, where 3 men were already seated when he walked in. Elias counted the doors. 2 doors. He sat down at the empty end of the table. The oldest uncle spoke first, his voice rough, one hand slowly turning the glass in front of him. "You were on the internet," he said. 40,000 people saw your face. No one in this family has a face on the internet. Never has. Elias didn't answer. The man in the middle continued. "That woman is a risk," he said. "She has the documents. She's about to sit in front of the federal government and start saying our names. And that cassette is worse, because we don't even know what's on it." "So what do you want?" Elias asked. The man in the middle placed his hand flat on the table. "The way this family handles things," he said. "The way your father and your uncles always handled something that wasn't allowed to exist. Both of those things disappear, and 6 months from now no one remembers that this week ever happened." The room went quiet. The third man, Ambrose Ferraro, sat at the far end of the table with a gold ring on his ring finger, and he smiled. It was the easy smile of a man trying to soften the air in the room. "Don't say it like that," Ambrose said. "The boys had a long night. Let him think." Elias looked at him for a moment, then turned back toward the other 2 men. He placed both hands on the table, palms down, and spoke very slowly. "My father died because he stayed silent," he said. "He knew something. He carried it inside himself. And he died in his office on a Saturday morning with a medical certificate no one ever bothered to read twice. I'm not going to die for the same reason." The oldest uncle stopped turning his glass. "Do you know what you're saying?" he asked. "I do," Elias replied. "Then let's vote," the uncle said. The man in the middle raised his hand first. "Against." The oldest uncle raised his hand next, more slowly, but he raised it all the same. "Against." Elias turned toward the far end of the table. Ambrose sat still for several seconds, then sighed, the sigh of a man being forced to choose between 2 nephews. "I'm sorry, son," he said. Then he raised his hand. 3 out of 3. Elias stood. He buttoned his coat. No one tried to stop him. "I still keep the harbor," he said. "Not as a question, but to make it clear. I still keep transport. Anything that requires 3 votes, I no longer have as of today." "That's right," the oldest uncle said. Elias gave one nod and walked out. He crossed the hallway, passed through the second door, and stepped onto the front steps covered in a thin layer of snow. Behind him, in the dining room, Ambrose Ferraro poured more liquor for the other 2 men and said something that made them both laugh, the sound carrying all the way out through the door. He laughed louder than either of them, and when the laughter finally died away, he excused himself for a moment to make a short phone call. 2 days later, Ambrose called him. His voice was warm, touched with regret, and he said the other 2 men had reconsidered, that they wanted to sit down and talk properly, and that this time they should choose somewhere more private than Beacon Hill. He suggested the old cold storage warehouse at berth number 9, the place the family still used when they had matters they didn't want a 4th person hearing. Elias agreed. He arrived alone, exactly as arranged. The cold storage building stood deep inside the harbor grounds, with steel doors, corrugated metal walls, and a vast empty interior where rows of shelving had been stripped bare, and a trace of cold still lingered from the cooling system, running off a generator. Elias stepped inside and counted the doors. 1 door. Only one. The steel door he had just walked through. He stopped in the middle of the floor. The ceiling lights came on. Sterling Ashcroft stood about 10 paces away, still wearing his overcoat, both hands in his pockets. Beside him were 4 men. Elias recognized 3 of them, and all 3 worked for Ambrose. Ambrose wasn't there. He was never present in places like this. The steel door behind Elias closed, the bolt sliding into place with a dry, clean sound. "You really did come alone," Sterling said. "I thought you were smarter than that." Elias didn't answer right away. He looked around the warehouse once, at the empty shelving, at the generator running in the corner, then back at Sterling. "You're afraid of the cassette," he said. "I want it," Sterling replied. "You brought it with you, didn't you?" Elias reached inside his coat. The four men shifted half a step forward. He pulled out a flat metal box about the size of his hand and set it on top of a wooden crate in the middle of the floor. Then he stepped back. Sterling looked at the box. He didn't approach it immediately. He gave a slight nod, and one of his men went over and opened the lid. There was no cassette inside. There was a stack of papers folded into quarters. The man picked them up, opened them, glanced over the first page, then handed them to Sterling. Sterling took them. He read the first page. He turned to the second. Then he stopped turning pages. "Those are your books," Elias said. "Not the version on your server. The bank reconciliation records, the part you couldn't erase because it was never in your hands." Sterling looked up. "Where did you get this?" "From the place you should have thought of," Elias said. "But you didn't, because all these years you've only known how to hide things. You've never had to protect them." Sterling tightened his grip on the papers. "You think you can bring this in here and walk back out?" Elias didn't answer. He raised one hand, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, then looked at Sterling and spoke very slowly. "You have about as long as it takes me to finish one glass of water to choose an exit." Sterling laughed. "There's only one door in here," he said, "and it's locked." "Exactly," Elias said. "So I suggest you choose quickly." At that moment, the bolt on the steel door snapped open. The door swung wide, cold air spilling outward in a white cloud, and through it walked two women. The first was Priscilla Vaughn, wearing a heavy coat with her badge displayed on her chest, and behind her more than a dozen people in windbreakers with gold lettering across the back poured into the warehouse in two lines. Walking beside her, still holding the cello case in both arms, was Delaney Shaw. Sterling spun around. Ambrose's four men backed toward the middle of the floor and then stopped, raising their hands when ordered. No one ran. There was nowhere to run. Sterling looked at Delaney, then at Elias, then at the papers in his own hand, and he began to understand the real order of events. "You knew he was going to call you here," he said. "I knew my uncle would call," Elias replied. "I didn't know you'd be here. That part was your choice." Vaughn walked forward, took the papers from Sterling's hand, glanced at the first page, then passed them to the person beside her. She turned toward Elias. "You came in here alone," she said. "You know that was stupid." "I know," Elias said. "But he wouldn't have taken the records out of his pocket for anyone else." Vaughn looked at him for another second, then turned away and began giving orders to her people. Delaney was still standing where she had entered, near the door, both arms around the instrument case. Elias walked toward her. He looked at her, and for the first time in all the time she had seen him, she realized he didn't know what to say. "You came," he said. Delaney glanced toward Sterling as he was being escorted toward the door. "You really thought I'd let you walk in here alone," she said. Augie Renner came the following morning on his own. No one had called him. He went to the federal building across the harbor, handed his identification over at the desk, sat waiting on a hallway bench for exactly 40 minutes in his gray sweater and carefully polished shoes, and when Vaughn came out to meet him, he stood and said that he wanted to give a statement. They took him into a small room with a metal table. Elias came in afterward. Delaney stayed outside, watching through the glass pane, until Vaughn turned back and nodded for her to come in too. Augie sat with his back straight, both hands resting on the table. He looked at Elias for a long time before speaking his first words. "I sold your family's name," he said. Elias didn't move. 4 years ago, Augie continued, "I gave Ashcroft signature samples, seal samples, and the list of old legal entities our family no longer used. He needed a surname no one in this city would dare touch. I sold him that name. I took cash. I thought it was only paperwork." Vaughn asked him why. Augie didn't answer her. He kept looking at Elias. "My daughter," he said. "She bought a house in Quincy. Then her husband left. Then her company closed. Then a debt notice came to her house for a loan she'd never signed, under her mother's name, and her mother had been dead for years. I went to Ashcroft and asked him to erase it for her. He said he could. He said everything had a price." The room went quiet. Delaney stood with her back against the wall, both arms folded across her chest. Then Vaughn opened a file, placed it in front of Augie, and pushed it slightly to the side so Delaney could see it too. "Explain this," she said. Augie looked down. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what was there. $900 a month, he said. 21 months. Delaney moved away from the wall. What? She said. Augie looked up at her, and it was the first time that morning he had looked directly at her. The money you paid never went into Meridian's books, he said. Not $1 of yours appears anywhere in that loan file. It went straight into a personal account. My daughter's account. Delaney stood still. She heard every word clearly, but it took a long moment for them to arrange themselves into a sentence that made sense. 21 months, she said. Yes, Augie said. Ashcroft erased my daughter's debt by moving that burden into another file. You were the one paying it for her. He called it a cash flow adjustment. I was sitting in the room when he said those words, and I nodded. Delaney raised a hand to her mouth. She stepped back half a pace, then stopped. What about the messages? She said. Augie was silent for several seconds. Then he reached into the pocket of his sweater, took out an old phone with a plastic casing, and placed it on the table. He pushed it toward her. Delaney didn't pick it up. Vaughn did. She turned on the screen and held it up. Against the black background was a silver badge shaped like an eagle's head. It was me, Augie said. Those 3 messages that night were mine. The 3 months of rent were mine too. I went to the counter, paid cash, waited for the receipt, and left. I didn't leave my name because I knew that if you knew it was me, you wouldn't take it. Delaney let out a short, dry laugh with nothing amused in it. You took $900 from me every month, she said, and then you gave some of it back by paying 3 months of my rent. Augie nodded. Yes, he said. He placed both hands on the table, palms facing upward, and stared at them as though they were strange objects he had never seen before. I took your money with my right hand, he said. Then every night I sat in the dark and typed messages to save you with my left. I thought the 2 things would cancel each other out. No one said anything. The heater in the room ran steadily. Elias stood at the end of the table, and he spoke for the first time since entering. You carried me before I even knew how to walk, he said. Augie closed his eyes. Did you know how my father died? Elias asked. Augie opened his eyes. I didn't know, he said. I swear I didn't know. I thought I was selling paper. I only thought I was selling paper. Elias looked at him for a long time. Then he turned toward Vaughn. He's yours, he said. He walked out of the room and he didn't look back. Augie remained sitting there with both palms turned upward on the table, and the only person who stayed behind looking at him was Delaney. That afternoon, Vaughn took them into a conference room where the whiteboard was covered with notes, and a projector was already running. She didn't ask Delaney if she was all right. She simply pulled out a chair and told her to sit down. Do you know why no one has touched you for the past 2 years? She said. Because they forgot about me, Delaney replied. No, Vaughn said. Because they needed you. She pressed the remote. A tangled diagram appeared on the screen. Hundreds of boxes connected by thin lines. 4,000 loans, Vaughn said. Every one of them in the name of someone who is dead. Every one of them sitting beneath legal entities carrying a surname no one dared touch. On paper, they're perfect. But a loan with no money flowing back into it is nothing more than a dead number, and bank reconciliation would catch it within a quarter. She moved to the next slide. Only a very small number of the files in this entire system have real money coming in consistently every month, she said. Yours is one of them. $900. Never one late payment. 21 months in a row, transferred from a real personal account belonging to a living person with a job and an address. Delaney looked at the screen. She said nothing. You're what makes all of this look real, Vaughn said. Every time auditors select a random sample, they pull several files to verify. Ashcroft knew that. He needed to make sure that when they happened to pull one of his, what they saw was a clean, steady stream of money, with nothing unusual about it. She turned and looked at Delaney. You were the person keeping that lie alive, she said. For 2 years. Delaney sat very still. Then she asked a question in a voice that was almost calm. What about my father? Vaughn remained motionless for several seconds. Then she opened a thin file already waiting at the end of the table, turned to a page marked with a paperclip, and pushed it across toward her. We pulled the accident file yesterday, she said. There's nothing unusual in the report. Slick road, loss of control, no second vehicle. She pointed to another sheet clipped underneath. But this is the maintenance record. Your father's car was taken into a shop 4 days before the accident. Brakes, tires, and power steering. Delaney looked at the sheet. She read the name of the garage in the upper corner. She didn't recognize it. That garage belonged to a subsidiary of Meridian Lending, Vaughn said. The business registration is buried 3 legal entities deep, but the same person approved the expenditures. We're not calling that proof of any. We're calling it a reason to reopen the case. Delaney set the paper down. Her left hand rested on the table, the fingers loosely curled, and she looked at that hand instead of anyone else. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Vaughn repeated. Outside in the hallway came the sound of footsteps and a door closing. Sterling Ashcroft was escorted past, his hands cuffed in front of him, his overcoat draped over another man's arm because they wouldn't let him wear it. He passed the glass pane without looking in. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his chin slightly raised, walking with the posture of a man who had stepped onto a stage 3 different times to accept awards beneath chandeliers. But when he reached the end of the hallway, he had to stop and wait for a door to open, and while he stood there, his shoulders dropped a little. Only a little. Then the door opened, and they took him away. Ambrose Ferraro was brought in through another entrance, uncuffed, walking between 2 people. He still wore that pleasant expression until Vaughn stepped into the hallway and handed him the maintenance record. He took it. He read it. He turned to the accident report clipped beneath it and looked at the date in the upper corner. Then he looked back at the maintenance sheet. 4 days. That easy smile fell from his face like something slipping from his grasp. I sold paperwork, Ambrose said. His voice suddenly sounded 10 years older. I only sold paperwork. Vaughn didn't answer. He handed the maintenance sheet back, and his hand was shaking so badly that it took him 2 tries. He was my cousin, Ambrose said, not speaking to anyone in particular. We grew up in the same house. Then he sat down in the nearest plastic chair, both hands resting on his knees, and he didn't stand again until someone told him to. The list of 4,000 names was reviewed again from the beginning that week, and one of the people going through it called Vaughn over to the computer and pointed at the screen. Vaughn read the line twice. Then she printed it out and carried it downstairs, where Delaney was waiting to sign the last part of her statement. Take a look at this, Vaughn said. Delaney took the page. In the middle of it, among names she didn't recognize, was Boone Mercer's name. His mother, Vaughn said. She died 4 years ago. The loan was created 8 months after that. Ashcroft wiped the whole thing clean for him. Just like that, 1 signature, and it was gone. Delaney looked at the number in the column on the right. In exchange for what? She asked. Vaughn looked at her. You already know, she said. In exchange, he went after other people. They let Delaney into the waiting room at the end of the hallway, where Boone was sitting alone at a metal table, no longer wearing his bomber jacket, only a white t-shirt and the same shoes, now muddy at the toes. He looked up when she walked in. He started to say something, some familiar line, something meant to put himself back in control, but then he saw the paper in her hand and stopped. Delaney placed it on the table and turned it toward him. Boone didn't look down to read it. He didn't need to. How long? She asked. 4 years, he said. He lifted one hand to his face, rubbed it once, then let it drop. It came to my house 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, he said. I was 24. I didn't know who to call. He said he could take care of it, and he did. Then 3 months later, he told me to drive somewhere with another man. Just sit in the car. Nothing else. The next time I had to get out of the car. The time after that, I had to talk. He stopped. He told me everyone had to do it once, he said. Then I did it a second time. After that, I stopped counting. Delaney stood on the other side of the table. She didn't sit down. You know something, she said. You and I carry the same number. Boone looked up. The same kind of paperwork, she said. The same signature from someone who's dead. The same person approving it. The difference is I didn't go sell it to somebody else. Boone opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face changed very slowly, and by the time it had finished changing, he no longer looked like the man who had stood on that rooftop that night. He lowered his head, both hands resting on the metal table, and his shoulders began to shake. He didn't say anything. Delaney watched him for a while. She didn't reach out. She didn't tell him she understood, and she didn't tell him she forgave him, because she didn't understand, and she hadn't forgiven him. She only said one last thing before turning away. Someone gave you a way out, she said, and you took it by pushing other people into the place you had just escaped from. That isn't something that happened to you. That's something you did." Then she walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. In the room next door, Grady Pike had been sitting since morning with a lawyer hired by his family. He didn't mention the woman on the rooftop at all. He kept asking the same question over and over, whether there was any way to remove the video from everywhere it had been reposted. And when they told him there wasn't, he sat in silence for a long time, before asking whether that would make his sentence worse. Late that afternoon, when all the formalities were finished and they told her she could go home, Delaney didn't go home. She asked someone to drive her to berth number 9. Then she walked along the rows of containers, turned onto the ramp of the abandoned parking structure, and started climbing. She didn't know why she was going up there. She only knew she needed to see it once in daylight. On the rooftop, the wind still came straight off the water with nothing to stop it, and the last light of the day washed the concrete in a pale gray. Police tape still stretched across one corner, one end torn loose and snapping in the wind. The concrete pillar stood there, bare now, with nothing wrapped around it anymore. And in the middle of that empty space, a man was kneeling. Elias wasn't wearing a coat. He was down on one knee on the wet ground, his head lowered, and he was picking up hair. He gathered it a little at a time. With 2 fingers, he lifted a strand from a puddle, flicked the water from it gently, then placed it into his open left palm. Then he shifted to another spot and did it again. Some strands had stuck to a thin film of oil, and he had to press his fingers against the concrete to peel them free. Some had caught in the cracks, and he used his fingernail to work them loose. He did it slowly, patiently, without frustration, like a man carrying out a task no one had asked him to do. Delaney stood at the top of the ramp and watched. She remained there for a long time before walking toward him. "What are you doing?" she asked. Elias didn't look up. He picked up another strand and placed it in his palm. "This doesn't belong here," he said. Delaney looked down at the concrete. In daylight, she could see more than she wanted to. Hair was scattered everywhere, in clumps in some places, only a few strands mixed with dust in others. His hair was there too, black and shorter, mixed in with hers. "It's already gone," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still picking it up." He shifted to the left, knelt again, and continued. Delaney watched him for another moment. Then she walked over and sat down beside him, lowering herself all the way onto the cold ground without hesitation. She reached out and began picking it up too. For a long time, neither of them said anything. There was only the wind and the sound of the loose police tape snapping in the far corner. She picked with her right hand. Her left rested open on her lap, serving as a place to gather what she found. After a while, she stopped, looked at the hair in her palm, and asked, "What are you going to do with this?" Elias didn't answer right away. He picked up one last strand near the base of the pillar, then leaned back and rested on his heel. "I don't know," he said. "Then why are you picking it up?" "Because I got here too late," he said. Delaney turned to look at him. He was still looking down at his palm. "I read your father's name in a file," he said, "and I circled it with a pen, and then I went to sleep. I knew there was someone still alive. I knew she was somewhere in this city, and I left it until the next day." He stopped. "I can't undo that," he said, "but I'm not going to leave this place the way it was." Delaney said nothing. She looked at his hands, his fingers stained with concrete dust and machine oil, his shaved head already beginning to show the faintest dark growth, the knees of his white shirt dirtied and ignored. She thought of the man who sat at the head of a table with a glass of water and a list memorized by heart. She thought of the man who had walked between 2 beams of headlights and whom no one dared stop. Then she looked at the man kneeling on the ground, picking up hair with 2 fingers, and she didn't know where to place those 2 images so they could fit inside the same person. By the time they finished, it was dark. Elias took out his handkerchief, spread it on the concrete, and together they placed the hair from their palms onto it. He folded all 4 corners inward carefully, then picked it up. "Let's go," he said. Delaney stood, brushed off her hands, and followed him down the ramp. Neither of them looked back at the concrete pillar again. Vaughn returned the cassette to Delaney at the end of that week, after the technical team had finished making a backup, and she told her the original belonged to her. Delaney brought it back to the instrument repair shop in Dorchester. She rolled up the door, switched on the desk lamp with the tin shade, and Elias stood waiting in the narrow aisle between 2 rows of shelves, both hands in his pockets, looking at the dust-covered instruments hanging on the walls. She found her father's old cassette player in the bottom drawer, wiped it clean with the hem of her shirt, plugged it in, and it still worked. She put the cassette inside. She pressed the button. There were several seconds of static, then the sound of a chair scraping across a wooden floor, and then a man's voice filled the empty shop. Delaney froze. She hadn't heard that voice in 3 years. Her father's voice sounded closer than she expected, warm and slightly rough, the voice of a man accustomed to talking with customers across a workbench. He said he was recording this in case it was ever needed, that he wasn't good with machines, so if something went wrong, he hoped whoever was listening would forgive him. Then he spoke about the papers. He said he had agreed to keep them, that he didn't understand everything written in them, but he understood enough to know that some of the names belonged to people who were no longer alive. Then a second voice came through. It was deeper, slower, and it interrupted naturally, the way two friends do when they're sitting at the same table. Elias, standing a few steps away, raised one hand and rested it against the edge of a shelf. He said nothing. He didn't move. The second voice said he had been wrong to let this continue for so long, that he had trusted the wrong person inside his own family, and that he couldn't take those papers home anymore. Then he said he knew he was placing a burden on his friend's shoulders, and he was sorry for that. Delaney's father said it was all right, that he would keep them, that no one paid attention to his place anyway. The tape kept running for a while with small sounds in the background, the sound of a glass being set down, someone breathing out. Then the second voice spoke one final sentence. "If anything happens to me," he said, "don't let the boy have to find all of this on his own." The tape hissed for several more seconds, then ended. Neither of them pressed stop. The machine kept running through the white static until Delaney reached over and switched it off. Elias was still standing exactly where he had been. He looked down at the floor. For a long time, he said nothing. Then Delaney turned toward the instrument case, standing beside the workbench. She opened it, lifted the velvet lining that had now come completely loose, and this time she aimed the desk lamp directly at the wooden bottom. There, carved with a small blade in shallow, slightly trembling strokes, were words she hadn't seen before, because she had been too focused on the things lying above them. C. F. I'm keeping it for you. Elias stepped closer. He bent down and looked at the carving. He traced one finger very lightly along the marks, then pulled his hand back. Your father kept his promise to mine all those years, he said, and no one ever came to thank him. Delaney didn't answer. She stood, walked to the corner of the shop, and lifted the cello out of its case. She did it with both hands, slowly, as though lifting something fragile. She pulled out her father's wooden chair, sat down, settled the cello between her knees, and picked up the bow. Elias didn't ask anything. He only stepped back. Delaney placed her left hand on the neck of the instrument. Her fingers rested loosely, curled as they always did. She tried to open them. Her index finger and middle finger came down. Her ring finger came halfway. Her little finger didn't move at all. She sat there for several seconds with her hand resting on the strings. Then she drew the bow. The first note came out rough and wrong, the string crying out with a sound that was almost embarrassed. The second note was a little better. The third slipped down half a step, because her ring finger couldn't hold its position. The fourth broke apart halfway through when she ran out of bow. 4 notes. 4 crooked, rough, ugly notes. Delaney lowered the bow. She sat still. Then her shoulders began to shake, and she started to cry. She cried out loud, the kind of crying she hadn't allowed herself in 3 years, both hands still holding the cello because she was afraid to let go. Elias didn't come closer. He stood where he was and let her cry, and he didn't offer a single word of comfort. When she finally looked up, her eyes still red, she spoke through broken breaths. It sounded terrible. "Yeah," he said. "But I still played it," she said. Elias nodded. Then he sat down on the wooden crate across from her, elbows resting on his knees, and spoke in an ordinary voice, as though mentioning something small. "Do you want to know why I shaved my head?" Delaney wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I thought you did it to humiliate them." Elias shook his head. "There was one season when my mother got sick," he said. "She lost all her hair in 3 weeks, and one morning she came downstairs to the kitchen, and my father was already sitting at the table with his head shaved, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. He didn't say anything. He just sat there." Elias looked down at his hands. "I don't remember much about my father," he said. "I couldn't remember his voice until today. But I remember that morning. That's the one thing I managed to keep from him." He raised his eyes to Delaney. "So when I was standing on that rooftop," he said, "I couldn't think of any other way." The story could have ended beautifully that night inside the instrument repair shop. But 3 days later, Delaney received a legal file from Vaughn's office, and among the documents was an inventory of assets belonging to the parties involved. She turned to the page listing the Seaport waterfront building, the same building whose windows she had cleaned for 2 years, first on the 34th floor and then on the 41st, and she saw that the owner was listed as Ferraro Development. She turned another page and discovered that the cleaning company paying her wages sat inside the subcontracting chain of that very company. She remained seated for a long time, with the file resting on her lap. The following afternoon, she met Elias outside the Ashmont Community Center. "I know you had no idea about any of this," she said. Elias didn't deny it. He said he had hundreds of subcontracting agreements, and had never once read the name of a single cleaner listed under any of them. "Exactly," Delaney said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." She handed the file back to him. "You didn't do anything to me," she said. "But the world that raised you took 3 years from me without you even seeing it. You didn't see me on the 34th floor. You didn't see 4,000 names inside your own records. You only saw me after someone had taken me onto a rooftop. I don't blame you for that. But I can't step into your life while everything around you is still the same." Then she turned away. Elias didn't stop her. The next 6 months were the longest 6 months of his life. He testified in federal court 3 separate times, and each time he had to open the books of Ferraro Development in front of people his family had spent 3 generations avoiding. He sold the service contracting division, sold 2 smaller transport companies, and lost most of his influence in every matter that required 3 votes. He explained himself to no one. He didn't call Delaney even once. The land that included the Ashmont Community Center was transferred to the city for $1, with a single condition written directly into the agreement that the property must remain a community center forever and could never be converted to another use. During that time, one afternoon Wilder Hoyt came to see Delaney at the entrance of the center. He had lost weight, his eyes were hollow, and both hands trembled as he pulled out an old phone. He told her that several weeks before that night, he had secretly recorded another video inside the warehouse, a video showing Sterling Ashcroft standing between stacks of cardboard boxes and personally giving Boone his orders. Wilder said he had been afraid, that he had hidden the video, and that twice he had intended to delete it, but couldn't bring himself to do it. He handed the phone to her and said only one sentence before leaving. "I did this when no one was filming me." That recording became the evidence that closed the entire case. All 4,000 fraudulent debts were canceled. Delaney didn't keep the compensation she received for herself. She established a fund in her father's name, and during its first year, that fund fully cleared the debts of the first 42 families on the list. The first person Delaney called was Wilder Hoyt's mother. Goldie enrolled in college again, majoring in social work, and she told her sister that she had chosen that field so that someday no one would have to spend 3 nights sitting in a hospital hallway without knowing who to call. Then winter returned. The Hollis Shaw Free School of Music opened inside the old instrument repair shop in Dorchester. The walls had been repainted cream, the dust had been cleaned away, and the old instruments had been restrung and hung in neat rows. 19 children came to the first lesson. Their laughter filled the room. They held their instruments wrong, missed nearly every note, ran between the rows of chairs, and changed seats so many times that Delaney had to clap 3 times before she could get them all to sit down. The room was bright and warm, the windows fogged with condensation, and outside, the first snow of the season was falling over the front steps. Just before the lesson began, Delaney looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. The same posture, the same black wool coat, except his hair had grown back, and there were a few lines on his face that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. He didn't step inside. He stood exactly where he had stood the first time. Delaney looked at him for a moment. Then she walked over carrying a bow and held it out to him. "I don't know how to play," he said. "Nobody here knows how to play," she replied. He took the bow. After the lesson, the 2 of them sat on the front steps of the shop, a thin layer of snow settling on their shoulders while the sound of children still drifted out from inside. He told her that all his life, he had counted the doors in every room he entered, counting them so he would always know how to get out. Then he added one more sentence. "This is the first room where I don't want to look for an exit." Delaney didn't answer. She simply reached out her hand, and he took it. The story of Delaney Shaw reminds us of something very simple that people too often forget. Society tends to assume that anyone in debt must be at fault, that anyone who is poor must be lazy, that anyone who stays silent must be weak. but the number printed on a debt notice can never measure the worth of a human being. Some debts are written falsely, and people lose their entire youth trying to pay them. And there are other debts that never appear in any ledger at all. Debts of kindness, the kind that can only be repaid by standing up for someone else at the exact moment they need it most. The strongest person isn't someone who has never been brought down. It's someone who has been brought down and still refuses to bring someone else down in return. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. How do you feel about the story of Delaney and Elias? And if you were in their place, what would you choose? Please leave a few words in the comments. We always look forward to hearing the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, peace, and comfort every day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.